Hello, God bless you. My name's Stephen. I'm the pastor of Graffiti Fellowship in Brooklyn, New York, and it's time for today's daily devotion. And our daily devotion, this series of videos is tools where we just read a chapter from the Bible each day. We tend to post these videos 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Today we're reading Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. Mark is the second of the Gospels in the New Testament. So the first book of the New Testament, the first four books of the New Testament are all the Gospels that teach about the life and ministry of Jesus. And Mark is the second in order. So it goes Matthew, Mark. We've read Matthew all the way through. There's 28 chapters in Matthew, so there are 28 videos that all go through the Gospel of Matthew. If you've not seen that, that's available on this channel in a playlist. You can go avail yourself to that as well. And now we're doing the same thing with the Gospel of Mark. And one of the things I shared in the first Mark video as we prepared to read chapter 1 is that a lot of scholars believe, in fact most scholars believe, that Mark was written first chronologically. Just what, he wrote his gospel before the other three were written. And a lot of scholars seem to they see evidence that Matthew and Luke intentionally aligned their gospel with Mark's gospel in order to give credibility to that testimony. One of the things the Bible teaches is that for any testimony to be valid, to carry weight, to really be worthy of consideration, it requires three or more witnesses. And so we have that in the Gospels. John's Gospel is very different than the other three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call the synoptic Gospels, which means they're all pretty similar. They follow generally the same structure, cover the same events. John's Gospel is very different, not for any negative reason, for a very positive reason. John wrote much later. He wrote his Gospel last. And I believe he saw the testimony of three witnesses had been established in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so John just writes from a different perspective in his gospel. And his gospel, over half of the book of John focuses on a single week of Jesus' life. So he just goes deeper into some of the events in Jesus' life, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke give more of an overarching history, start to finish, of Jesus' earthly ministry. So a little bit of background for you there. Today we're reading, as I said, Mark chapter 7. And this chapter we're approaching the halfway point in the Gospel of Mark. This is a little shorter chapter than chapter 6 was. And in this chapter we have several subsections. The first, beginning in verse 1, Jesus teaches about inner purity. Then we have the faith of a Gentile woman. And then the third that we'll read today in this chapter is Jesus heals a deaf man. Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, says, "One day some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived in Jerusalem to see Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples had failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they've poured water over their cupped hands as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. This is but one of the many traditions they've clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of religious law asked him, 'Why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition? They eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony.' And Jesus replied, 'You hypocrites! Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce. They teach man-made ideas as commands from God. For you ignore God's law and substitute your own tradition.'" And then he said, "You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God: honor your father and your mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it's all right for people to say to their parents, I'm sorry, I can't help you, for I vowed to give to God what I would have given to you. In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents, and so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. And this is only one example among many others. Then Jesus called to the crowd to come and hear. All of you listen, he said, and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You're defiled by what comes from your heart. Then Jesus went to a house to get away from the crowd, and his disciples asked him what he meant by the parable he had just used. Don't you understand either, he asked. Can't you see that the food you put into your body cannot defile you? For food doesn't go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer. By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. Now, this is a reference to some of the Old Testament law and practice of we find in the Jewish law clean and unclean foods, for example. Verse 20, and then he added, it's what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, hateful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you. Then Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in, but he couldn't keep it a secret. Right away, a woman who had heard about him came and fell at his feet. Her little girl was possessed by an evil spirit, and she begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. Since she was a Gentile, born in Syrian Phoenicia, Jesus told her, first I should feed the children, my own family, the Jews. It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs. She replied, that's true, Lord, but even the dogs under the table are allowed to eat the scraps from the children's plates. Good answer, he said. Now go home, for the demon has left your daughter. And when she arrived home, she found her little girl lying quietly in bed, and the demon was gone. Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. A deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone, and he put his fingers into the man's ears. Then, spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Instantly the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone, but the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. That's the end of Mark chapter 7. I just love what it says here. Everything Jesus does is wonderful. That's why we do these things. That's why we spend time each day in his word, because everything that he does is wonderful. And we want our lives to be wonderful because of our devotion to him. Not just for our own sake, but we want our lives to be a wonderful blessing to others as well. Thanks so much for participating in this video. Look forward to seeing you next time for Mark chapter 8. God bless.